Elemental Spectral Helix Nightblade Deadeye is a really long name to pronounce, but also a really good build. I've done Shaper, Elder, Maven, Cortex, Searing Exarch, Eater of Worlds, and some other bosses with no problem and no death, except when it was completely my error. For example, the memory game, I die every time and I don't care because I'm in softcore and I'm not going to be bothered with the memory game. Or I've also died to some other errors of mine, such as staying in Shaper Beam and Degen Ground at the same time. By mistake, of course, but it still happened. This build is otherwise really tanky, and you can tank quite a lot of abilities, such as Shaper Bolts with no problem, plenty of Maven's abilities, and many other things, while having really good damage actually. Also, huge disclaimer before we start, this build was initially made by Younggrown, and this is my variant on the build. It's a bit less tanky, but also has a bit more damage, because Younggrown initially made a build for hardcore, and I'm in softcore, so I can afford to lose a little bit of tankiness for a little bit more damage, or sustain, or whatever other quality of life things I've done, which you will see. Also, all the gear that I show here, and the gems and all that, are things that you want to work towards. You won't have all these things right at the beginning, but it also won't take all that long to get them. There will be some things you have to decide in the beginning, especially mana related things, because we run Grace Determination, Herald of Ice, and Defiance banner, and that basically reserves 135% of our mana. So as I said, don't expect this gear to be realistic. This is a fairly min-maxed build, and I will tell you what you want to look for each gear slot. But first of all, let's start with the tree and the Ascendancy. We go Deadeye because we get some really good damage and defensives. Let me explain. First we get Far Shot. If you don't know how Spectral Helix works with Far Shot, Spectral Helix's rotations count as travel. So if you know how to position yourself decently, you'll basically get this all the time to maximum value, and it's a 60% more damage multiplier. We also get Gathering Winds for Tailwind and the increased effect that you get from Gale Force. Then we get Windward because since we attack really fast, we basically have 10 Gale Force at all times, and even when we get hit and we lose all the Gale Force, getting it back is a matter of like 2 seconds. And the last thing you'll want to get is Focal Point for increased effect of your marks and some quality of life when it comes to marks. We use Assassin's Mark and we automate it with a mark on hit and life tap setup. Now let's look at some more interesting decisions for the tree. We want quite a lot of mana reservation efficiency because, as I said, we run 4 auras. 2 of them are 50% auras, so that takes quite a lot. We also take this Evasion Mastery, which grants 25% increased mana reservation efficiency for Grace. This one right here is not that mandatory because you might not be able to get the energy shield, at least in the beginning. We want this Claw Mastery for basically permanent blind since we attack really fast, and some other interesting things that we get are this right here, the accuracy bonus, which gives us quite a lot of accuracy, increased effect of elusive, which we stack because we use Nightblade, and if you don't know what Nightblade does, it grants 1% critical strike chance while elusive, and also plus 138% critical strike multiplier while you have elusive from Nightblade. You might also be wondering why we're taking this will right here. Well, as I said, we are stacking elusive effect, and this grants us 40% increased elusive effect, and a Dagger Mastery also offers critical strike multiplier for skills supported by Nightblade, which is huge. This jewel is just some rare jewel. You want anything you can get your hands on which improves your build. Power charges are not mandatory since even without this we're still at 100% critical strike chance, but it's nice to have. We get Ghost Dance, but only if we have Energy Shield, which you can get like this with these nodes. You can only get it this way with the Glorious Vanity Doriani jewel. You can only get this way because the Gravicious modifier on body armor, which grants 10% of maximum life as extra maximum energy shield, has been changed. So this is basically our only way to gain a good source of energy shield. And we also have path up here for the mana reservation efficiency and increased effect of your auras. We also take these nodes here. These two below, I'd say they don't take until you have all the other important nodes. But now let's go to the other side of the tree. We also have really good frenzy charge generation, not only power charge generation, because of this mark mastery. What this also grants us is marked enemy takes 10% increased damage, which is like a 10% more multiplier. Don't quote me on that. We also take this, the 40% increased effect of non-damaging ailments. Since we crit all the time and we do deal lightning damage, quite a high amount of it, this helps our shock effect a lot. The projectiles deal 20% increased damage for each enemy pierced. Might seem like just a small multiplier to our damage, but remember, Spectral Helix has infinite pierce. So if you have, for example, just 10 mobs on your screen and your Spectral Helix hits all of them, that's 200% increased damage. This node right here is also the reason you are able to do simulacrums very easily and fairly early on. This node, critical strike chances increased by chance to suppress spell damage, is a really good way of gaining a high amount of critical strike chance. Because we are at 96%, you will also need to get some on your gear, but we'll get into that in a minute. This wheel right here is not mandatory. I only took it for quality of life because I like having more projectile speed because it does the damage faster, so to say, because Spectral Helix is a slow traveling projectile. If you want more defenses, you can just delete this one here and maybe take this whole wheel, or depending on what you want, you can also go for this Chaos Wheel. Remember, this is quite a flexible build and you will change things the further you go with it. Even without the energy shield, it's still a really solid build. I also didn't have energy shield when I first started and it took me quite some while to find the craft when I leak started this. And I also never had a problem not having that energy shield, but it's a pretty big boost to your defensive layers and it's really nice to have. But now since you can't get that, I do recommend maybe not taking these nodes right here and these nodes right here, and instead just going for this when you have the chance for the glorious Vanity Doriani and the Corrupted Soul. You have a pretty high total life of around 5.5k, but I also have some really good gear which allows me to get here. But even without that, you should be able to get fairly close to 5k easily. We also have some insane life leech and life on hit from multiple things. We have life leech, we have on hit, and we also have on kill from multiple sources. Same thing goes for mana and same thing goes for ES. We have really high evasion rating, really high armor, and spell suppress chance is pretty much maximum with a tiny bit of investment, and we also move really fast. Now let's get a bit into the skills. Nightblade is mandatory for reasons I've already explained. This is an immense multiplier to our damage. Trinity, you will have 50 lowest resonance at all time because we deal both cold and lightning damage. Inspiration is really nice for mana and damage. Added lightning damage is nice because we also use Herald of Ice, so these two kind of balance each other out, and elemental damage with attacks just for more damage. For us, I've already said we use Graced, Herald of Ice, Determination, also have an Enlighten. Remember, this is something you want to work towards, but of course without the Enlighten, you will need to lose, for example, Defiance banner. We also have a cast when damage taken while Molten Shell setup. I haven't activated this, but this will always be active, and as you can see, it's a huge boost to our defenses. Of course, when in danger or when Molten Shell is on cooldown, you always have Molten Shell. Withering Step, this is essential. Without this, the build isn't even nearly close to being as good as it is. Due to the cooldown and everything, this will basically trigger when you have 180 effective elusive, which your maximum effective elusive is 220. So when you use this and then re-attack, you basically renew your elusive. This should always be on left click. If it's on left click, you don't have to worry about it. Focus on helmet. This is very important. You want on your helmet to have this modifier, the trigger socketed spells when you focus with a 0.25 second cooldown. This is very important as it allows us to cast Tornado and Hydrosphere linked with Onslaught and increased duration. You want to use this when on full mana basically because you cast two abilities and it takes quite a toll on your mana. Because of this setup right here, we have permanent Onslaught on bosses, we have exposure to bosses, and we have quite a big amount of extra damage because of the reflects 10% of damage taken to enemies line on the tornado skill. The increased duration also allows it to be basically up 95% of the time because there will be like a second or half a second where your focus is still on cooldown and tornado and hydrosphere aren't there anymore. You also have an automated Assassin's Mark on hit setup. Use Assassin's Mark, Mark on hit and life tap. This doesn't take a toll on our mana and it automates the whole process. You want 20 quality on your Assassin's Mark because that grants 5% chance to grant a power charge when hit, which is very nice because, as I said, we hit quite a lot. So you'll basically always have maximum power charges. Whirling Blades and Ancestral Protector are linked to faster attacks, which allows us to move really fast due to the Whirling Blades, and just gives a little bit more damage to an Ancestral Protector, which isn't enabled because that grants us more damage, and I wanted this to be as realistic damage as possible. Also, let me re-enable Enlighten. Now let's move on to the items. For the weapon, we use a Gemini Claw because of the life gained for each enemy hit by attacks, and also the mana gained for each enemy hit by attacks. On the weapon, the three most important stats are cold damage, lightning damage, and critical strike chance. You want these three to be as high as possible, and if possible, get increased attack speed. For the shield and most items really, all you want is maximum life, chance to suppress spell damage, and some other things here and there that you need for your build, such as resist, attack speed, or damage, or strength and int, which I have here on my helmet, whatever helps your build. For the boots, these are pretty endgame because they are better than the one you normally take. For your boots, you normally want Adziri Step. This is the only unique we are using, besides Glorious Vanity, but that's a bit more endgame when you want your energy shield. Adziri Step is a really good unique item for this build because of the really high chance to suppress spell damage that you can get, 30% increased movement speed, the high evasion rating, and the fairly good life. Upgrading from this will be quite more expensive, and there are far better things that you can upgrade before you upgrade these boots, so you'll want to upgrade this fairly late. For the amulet, I got an insane amulet. The same thing applies as to the rest of the gear. You want life and whatever else you can get that helps your build. For the anoint, I took Claws of the Falcon, which is this node right here. Depending on your wants and needs, you might get something else, and that's totally up to you. I just decided to go for a bit more damage. Rings, same story, except you want on at least one of your rings to have minus mana cost. I don't have on this one because I just wanted to see how far I can take my damage, but normally I do have minus mana cost as well. It helps with your mana issues tremendously. Same rules for the belt, and for the flasks, you want a diamond flask for increased global critical strike chance, you want a movement speed flask for when you're mapping, which you will switch with something else when you're doing bossing, a granite flask, and an onslaught flask, which again you will swap when you're doing bosses because on bosses you already have permanent onslaught from your helmet setup. So Quicksilver and Silver Flask are both flasks you change when you're doing bosses for ones that grant you more survivability. For example, the one that grants evasion rating, not armor, you can put it here instead of the onslaught one, and instead of the Quicksilver one, you can put the one that grants phasing and 10% chance to suppress spell damage, which will cap you or just bring you closer to the cap of your spell suppression chance. Let's look at the configuration to see that I'm not scamming you and I'm not selling you a 50% effect of shock build, even though we do use shock. The bandits, you kill all of them. The major god, I chose Soul of the Brine King for the cannot be frozen and reduced effect of chill on you, so we can go fast. And also stun recovery is nice, I guess, but I don't remember getting stunned on this build because, well, I have quite a lot of life and all that. For the minor god, we take Soul of Garukan for reduced effect of shock and cannot be blinded and cannot be maimed. It is really nice and a big quality of life improvement because of some map mods. The always on full life doesn't really change much except give me plus 10% to spell suppression chance because of a node on the tree. As I said, we always have power and frenzy charges at maximum. Gale Force will always be at maximum even when you take hits and it puts it back to 0 because we gain Gale Forces extremely fast. Inspiration charges are always at maximum. We always have Onslaught, but this doesn't change anything because I have the Flask enabled. We also have Tailwind, but this is also already enabled without being enabled here because of the Ascendancy point. We are always elusive, and the minimum you will be elusive for is 180. The maximum is 220, so on average you'll be at 200, but I wanted to set an expectation as good as possible for basically your minimum damage. You are leeching all the time, but you might not get the node that grants you 30% increased damage while leeching. This isn't such a huge boost in damage that you have to take it, it's just nice if you have some extra point. So I didn't enable it because you might not get it. Trinity, as I said, lowest resonance is 50. This will always be at maximum. Projectile travel distance, this will always be at maximum if you know how to position yourself, which isn't hard because of the way Spectral Helix works. You only have to be like under half a screen away from the mob that you're trying to do max damage to, due to our really high attack speed and the 20% chance to blind on crit, which we always crit. We basically always blind enemies. And because we always crit and do fairly high amounts of lightning damage, we always shock. And from what I've seen, the shock tends to be at around 20 plus to really strong mobs, to up to around 35% for any other mob. Now, these numbers I got before I allocated this node. So with this node, that should be quite a bit higher. I'd say maybe expect at least 25 to 30% even on the strongest mobs, and maybe around 40% to the not as strong ones. But I put it at 25 because, as I said, I'm not trying to scam you out of your time and effort, and I'm really trying to give you as realistic as possible DPS and everything for this build. Also, once again, please remember this is something you have to work towards. You won't have all these things right at the beginning. So yeah, this is basically it. And remember, if you don't like how Spectral Helix works, you won't have fun with this build. And that's pretty much the most important thing. You have to love the playstyle. I was a bit skeptical about Spectral Helix at the beginning, but it really grew on me quite fast. Maybe because of all the quality of life changes I've done, such as more projectile speed and all that. But I really think it's a really nice build, even without the energy shield. Because as I said, I've played the version of this build that doesn't have energy shield, and it was fine. And remember, this build is quite flexible, so you can do kind of whatever you want with it. Just try not to go too far and to take the things that I've said are important. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching, and if you have any suggestions for how I can make the build better or my future videos better, they are really appreciated, and I'm looking forward to seeing those comments. Hope you enjoyed. See you in the next one. Bye bye.